you on the West Coast and out in Hawaii and Alaska. I guess it's lunchtime for some of you in the central part of the country, and now after lunch, and so you guys have to stay awake and stay with me because you've got some carbs sitting in your bellies. What I want to talk to you about today, I want to start talking about the regulatory structure that's behind applicator certification and the training of people that handle pesticides in the workplace, whether that's in agriculture or in non-agricultural environments. And I would like to acknowledge that many of the slides that I'm using today and many of the illustrations and photos I have begged, borrowed, and stolen from all of my colleagues across the country, including this nice gentleman whose picture I stole off of the University of Washington's Panache website. That's Ofelio Borges, and he's the Hispanic Education Coordinator with Washington Department of Agriculture that does a lot of hands-on training and private applicator training for Hispanic language individuals in the state of Washington. So, Ofelio, I hope you're on board, and you can see that I've got you up there prominently for all of the work that you do. So, let's get down to my little arrow button here. We're going to start with the regulations. And I think before we really get into the regs, for folks who don't work around pesticides, many, I think, have a perception of agricultural use products. That pesticides are used in agriculture, yet that they're used in other places as well. Probably one of the largest pesticides in the United States is, you guys can't see, but I'm going to pick up water, is our drinking water. We have chlorine in drinking water.
Yeah,
so,
it's very hot.
Hospitals, antimicrobials, so the whole gamut of anything that controls the pest. So it's, people that are out on the farm, people that are in forests, people that are dealing with waterways, people that are dealing with drinking water, your parks, your schools, janitors, Lysol, everything is considered. And so it's not just an agricultural scenario that are people that end up using personal protective equipment to protect themselves from exposure. If we look at the workplace environment, and if we're looking at who needs to be managed for workplace safety, the parent federal organization for that is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And so OSHA's responsibility at the federal level is to protect employees from workplace hazards, and those hazards may include pesticides.
I'm on a conference call. I mean a webinar, and I can't get it on my thing, so I got to do it on the phone.
And so when we look at this, and we look at workplace hazards, the agricultural community and the farmer come to mind. But OSHA actually exempts farm family or farmers, I believe, and people correct me because I'm not an OSHA expert, if there's more than 10 employees, then they do fall under OSHA regulations. If there's fewer than 10, they fall and are exempt from it. And then OSHA also has other exemptions on, city workers and things like that, if it's a federal program versus a state program. So OSHA looks at workplace hazards for employees. Now, as with many federal regulations, there are state agencies that have taken over the responsibility and have gone into agreement with different federal agencies. And so with OSHA, there are 25 different states, if this is an accurate slide to date, that have adopted their own OSHA. So they'll take the federal regulations, codify them, and then also potentially add their own restrictions. So something that may not occur at the federal level, exempting agriculture, for example, a state OSHA program may bring agricultural into their fold. So just because something doesn't happen at the federal level doesn't mean that that's equates to identical in the state. And so if we look at Washington, Oregon, South Carolina, Tennessee, New Mexico, Alaska, and somehow I put you as Alabama up there. I think that's probably Alabama. Sorry about that, Mariah. They're going to have their own restrictions that they'll have to adhere to. So again, Pat Hastings delivered a presentation from Rutgers University and shared with us this summer.
Can people please mute their phones?
The conference is now in silent mode.
Found that only about 10% of the farms are actually OSHA regulated. But again, farms aren't the only place where pesticides are applied. So looking at how personal protective equipment plays into OSHA's requirements, basically they're general industry standards 1929 Code of Federal Regulations, that's what CFR stands for. 1910 has general PPE requirements, eye protection, respiratory, hand, and then toxic substances that could come into play, again, whether they were adopted by a state program or federally for people that might handle those that are not otherwise exempted from the OSHA requirements. And pretty much OSHA's training expectations come down to selection of PPE, make sure that they've got the appropriate PPE, and that there's some sort of customized training, whether that's done in-house or by a contractor. And again, many of the state OSHAs, in Washington State, if they're going to be our labor and industries, they'll have consultants that will come out and do training programs with employers to make sure that their individuals are brought up to speed on those protective equipment standards and understand their selection and the appropriate use of pesticides. And again, some of the further expectations would be, again, ensuring not just that the employee is trained on the proper use, but also to ensure that they're actually using that PPE, which was one of the concerns that Kim mentioned in her introduction. And then if you're using PPE, to make sure that it's in good condition and that they're following the manufacturer's cleaning and care instructions as well. And if it's not necessarily the state OSHA coming out, it may be the manufacturers of the PPE themselves. So when I've done training programs, I've brought in North Safety or different respirator suppliers or glove distributors and come in and had them actually do the training on their different types of devices. So those are some of the expectations. And with respiratory, there's a little bit more elaborate. Most programs that have a formal respiratory program are going to require some sort of written program, require a medical evaluation, fit testing annually, fit checking every time you're wearing it, following some sort of change-out schedule, and I'll talk a little bit about that later in the training session this afternoon. So that's kind of what's expected from your OSHA and pretty much standard, and now we're actually seeing some of this on pesticide label with the new sulffugen. Very formalized requirements for a respiratory program. And this I just went on to Dr. Google and pulled up OSHA respirator training or PPE training, and I found a nice little checklist from one of the state OSHAs and a fit testing DVD that you could watch online. So a fair amount of resources can find from both the state OSHA as well as federal. That's about all I'm going to say about OSHA. So I think if there's any questions regarding OSHA or some clarifications, I'm kind of hitting this at the 10,000-foot level. Now would be the time to entertain those before I kind of move really more into PPE and EPA's administration of the pesticide program.
Okay, Amy does have a question online. Amy, if you can hit *6 to unmute your phone.
Yes.
Hi. My questions were actually directed to Kim, Carol.
Okay. I'd love to.
So when we get back to those.
University of Maryland has a question for Kim.
Okay, I can't see my questions anymore. At first I couldn't get rid of them. Now they've disappeared. But I had asked if we could have a little more information about what you presented, Kim, about the groups. I presume you broke down the data that you got back that you presented very nicely about what were the reasons why people were not understanding what PPE was available or how to use it properly. And for instance, I'm particularly interested in understanding the difference between the different groups. As Carol just mentioned, we have certified applicators, non-certified applicators, trainers, handlers, and others, not trainers, workers, handlers, and others, all of whom get different types of training and by different sources. And I think it would be very helpful to know if you broke it down so we could get some more understanding of the reasons why the different groups were dissatisfied with the training.
Amy, Kim was talking about the stakeholder meeting that was held last March, and so it was an audience response of the participants of that stakeholder group. So chemical registrants, educators, OSHA representatives. Who else was in that room? Handlers. Yeah, there were some handlers in the room, and so it was a really broad representation of people that deal with pesticides. pesticide PPE training. It wasn't an assessment of people that apply pesticides and handle pesticides. You want to follow up with that?
We can follow up with that offline. Yeah, is that it?
Amy Brown.
There's three other ones. Aaron, if you could hit *6 to unmute your phone.
Aaron Bauer, University of Nebraska. Do you have a question?
Well, it looks like actually she just had a question about being on the air. John had a question online. John, if you could ask your question, hit *6 to unmute your phone. John, are you there? If you could hit *6 to unmute your phone.
John, if you have a question, *6 to unmute your phone. All right. If not, we'll go ahead and move along.
Okay, there's two more. Ann. Let's see. She's just asking for participants. Now, Max is another one. Max, if you can hit *6 to unmute your phone, please.
Max Kiefer, did you have a question? All right. Terrence, do you have a question?
I just have an observation relative to the OSHA regulatory perspective. OSHA has agricultural operations, which is OSHA regulation specific to agricultural operations.
Correct.
So I did some due diligence on that back at the last seminar, and I found out there are 7 OSHA regulatory paragraphs that apply to agricultural operations. One of them would be hazardous communications requirements, HAZCOM.
Right.
So you have that requirement that falls under OSHA, but the respiratory protection, of course, was not under OSHA, and that would fall back to the EPA local protection standard.
Yeah, my good colleague Pat Hastings from Rutgers knew that I was probably going to get some questions on this, and thank you, Pat, for sending some hints to me along the way, and looked at one of the training manuals for OSHA on agriculture, and HAZCOM still plays, and general duty responsibilities still play. It's just when you really get the worker protection standard that OSHA says we're stepping back, EPA, because it's a label requirement for worker protection standard compliance, they'll alleviate and give that to EPA to regulate that portion.
And Carol, I have a question. This is Kim Faulkner from NIOSH, and it may be more of a comment than a question, but like the glove, eye protection and some of the different regulations aren't specific to pesticides or don't consider tailored to pesticide use. So when they talk about it's more for safety oriented as opposed to exposure.
They do have Kim's question was that a lot of the PPE deals with non-pesticide exposure, but in my very superficial review of some of the OSHA, they do deal with chemical hazards. And so those chemical hazards would be more similar to what your pesticide exposures would be than electrical shock and those sorts of things. Okay, we're going to do a really quick review of what pesticides are because as I've been training for many years, when I use the word pesticide, many people who are not in the know, if you will, equate the word pesticide with insects. A pesticide controls insects. Well, pesticide is a really big umbrella term that basically says it's going to control any pest. So on this slide here, we have your typical Tretlan and herbicide, something that controls weeds. That is a pesticide. Ear tags on cattle for taking care of flies. That is a pesticide. Your flea collar on your dog is a pesticide. Your 409, because it actually claims to control germs, a germ on your counter is a pest. And so 409 is a pesticide and is registered by EPA. My favorite, because I do a little bit of bird hunting in Montana, I always have to carry my bear spray with me because my shotgun's not enough. And so bear spray repels a pest, so it's classified legally as a pesticide. And then we've got, your fumigants for grain fumigants and rodent fumigants and things like that. So pesticide is really an all-inclusive term. It does not mean just insects. So again, lots of different things. So again, if it claims it controls, it then falls under the regulatory scrutiny of the Environmental Protection Agency. So Kevin Keeney did a really nice summary at our summer meeting for certified trainers and state lead agencies that deal with applicator certification, and kind of figure out some of these numbers that I think were really good backgrounds. 20 major manufacturers, about 100 smaller manufacturers of pesticides, again, whether it be bear spray or herbicides or fungicides. 1,165 active ingredients, 16,000 different products that EPA registers. 1.2 billion pounds are used in the United States per year. 1.9 million farms on 104 million households. I think a lot of people don't realize that chlorine they've got in their laundry cabinet is a registered pesticide. And then about $12 billion spent. So there's just kind of some background information. And I was going to try to show this video because Andrew Softenson, my good colleague from North Dakota State University, really got us in the flavor for where we were, 20, 30, 40 years ago. We can go back now on YouTube and get these historical videos on how we were handling pesticides in the 40s and the 50s. And this showed this little video clip, and I've got it in the resource link for you to go to, and I have lots of other resources. Kind of tells you where we were and how we protected ourselves. And I think really we've come a long way in applicator education and risk mitigation by how product labels are written today.
We have one live meeting question. Adrian Busby, if you can hit star 6 to unmute your phone, please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Adrian.
Okay, I just wanted to go back and ask a clarifying question. You stated that the hazardous communication standards do apply to agricultural workers, and that is not completely preempted by the worker protection standard?
Yes, because there's other hazards on a farm than just pesticides.
Okay, but to be clear, as far as pesticide exposure is concerned, the WPS definitely applies to farm workers.
Correct.
And the HCS applies to workers such as landscapers or pest control handlers, pesticide handlers. Would that be correct?
The way the directive that I read from OSHA in their ag section is it said other people that do pest control. However, since it was under the agricultural standard, I would assume that that's the commercial individuals that are doing protection in agriculture, not the city parks, the golf courses, or not in agriculture. But I am not an expert on OSHA.
Right. Okay, thank you very much.
Correct. Yeah, and they have to provide them with the protection. Correct. Nadia here in the audience was clarifying that OSHA still has full responsibility for workplace. And so under the general duties, if there was something egregious that happened even with pesticides, OSHA can step right in and say we're going to come in as well. So they still have the general duty, hazardous communication and protection. So let's move back on to pesticides and kind of think where did, and I've got a typo on this slide, where did pesticide training really start, and where did maybe we really start focusing on PPE? And it really was generated not from workplace hazards. It really was generated from environmental protection. Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, the concern back in the 50s, late 50s, 60s, and 70s that we really needed to do a better job of protecting the environment. And so our president back then basically said we've got to put in place some environmental policy. And part of that environmental policy and giving that responsibility and establishing the Environmental Protection Agency basically brought about his mission to manage protection of the environment. And so really EPA was brought into play for pollution control with pesticides and other items, and really wasn't focused initially, at least, on personal protection. However, when we look at really what happened with the registration of pesticides and the risk mitigation evaluation of pesticides, really where FIFRA comes into play with personal protective equipment and protecting the person that's handling those products is the pesticide label. And so the registration of pesticides puts that line of defense available for them to access what they need to do in order to protect themselves. And then as pesticides pesticides go through reevaluation, because they have to get reevaluated every 15 years, those standards can be brought up if we know more things about the risk, or there's changes like there was with the respirator standard several years ago. There was updating of the standard, needs to update the label. And at that same time, basically the FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, also brought into play certification and training, and a little bit later in date, worker protection. And one thing that one has to realize is that with FIFRA, there's a risk-benefit balancing. Because we realize that there are risks that are out there with some of these products, but there's a benefit also to personal protection, mosquito control, as well as agricultural production structures, carpenter ants, termites in your home, etc. And that the label ultimately is the law, and it is the risk mitigation device. And so FIFRA basically transformed who could have access to these products. And the goal then was to ensure that the unqualified individual didn't have access to the high-risk products. So the unqualified person could still have access to the low-risk products, but they couldn't have access to the high-risk products. And so FIFRA required certification of those people that would use what's classified as restricted use pesticides. So those people merchandising them, selling them, distributing them, and those people using them. So typically what happens when there's a federal regulation is states will then take that federal regulation and they will actually put it into their state law, and many states then added further restrictions on top of what the federal restrictions were, and so states were quite divergent in how they approached certified applicators, but all meeting the minimum federal standards. So the Office of Pesticide Programs is the program within EPA that administers pesticide registration and applicator certification and the worker protection standards. And just to kind of give you a feel for them, again, their mission is not just the environment, which is kind of the mindset at the time, but also human health. And it's a pretty large contingent within EPA, about 750 staff members. When EPA takes its responsibility of registering a pesticide, they're going to evaluate the risk, the human risk factor, animal risk factors, livestock, honeybees, those sorts of things, as well as environment, surface water, groundwater. And so when they look at that product, they look at the risk profile, they can make several decisions in the labeling process. They can say, we're not going to register it, but we're going to cancel some uses because something came up that they don't want to manage that risk. They can cancel the use, or they could delete that use to say, hey, you know, we've got some extra risk here. One way to modify that is to just not allow it to be used there anymore. They can put ecological safeguards in, risk mitigation. They can require special packaging that it can only come out in water-soluble packs, so there's no handling of that material by the applicator. They can put on engineering controls, closed system requirements, so somebody wouldn't be handling it. They can limit the amount of product that's put out, so that there's only so much that one could be exposed to as compared to how frequently it might be applied to mitigate that risk. And they can put on safeguards for ground and surface water. But the last three is where I'm going to really focus on with this is the risk to humans. They can, again, classify that product as a restricted use pesticide, so only somebody that showed a level of competency can have access to it. They also can put on protective clothing or device requirements, respirators, gloves, aprons, chemical-resistant suits to mitigate that risk. And on areas where people would often go back into an area that's been treated, such as in agriculture where you might have irrigation, they can have entry intervals. Don't allow somebody to come in for 4 hours, 12 hours, 72 hours to allow the material to dry down and maybe degrade a little bit. And then also the worker protection standard, which I'll talk a little bit about, that's what WPS stands for, is Worker Protection Standard, actually has requirements that manages risks for those people that handle the pesticide. That's what a handler is, as compared to workers that would just come back in and not actually handling product that they will be entering a treated area. And so these are kind of the gamut of what EPA can look at in how they mitigate the risk of that particular product. Once a product unregistered, it's really important to remember, you can ignore the first bullet, is that every product goes through a reevaluation every 15 years. So if there's new science, if there's new protective equipment, if there's new things that they can put on that label to add protection, this would be the time they could do that. And probably the best example for updating levels of protection on personal protective equipment that's ongoing right now is the soil fumigants. Soil fumigants from, 5 years ago had just a little bit on personal protective equipment, and now they have pages on personal protective equipment, including an entire written respiratory program protocol that has to be followed. And that's all on the label now, not just referred to that you would have to follow some standard. It's all very much dictated from the label. And so that's the time where labels can be updated, as well as any time that a registrant makes a change to a label. This is a time that language can be cleared up for clarity. And then the last bullet here basically says that EPA can act without waiting if some new concern comes up. And this particular concern was one that came up that really wasn't related to personal health, but it had to deal with environmental issues. And with this particular product there, EPA worked with the registrant, and it was off the market in a very short order of time when it was obvious that there were some concerns with the chemical. So they do have the authority to basically cancel and stop sales of material. So just this is again from Andrew Thorstensen from North Dakota. He deals a lot with grain, and so they use a product called toxin, and he was doing some applicator training in North Dakota and said, if I go back to the label from 1966, it was about 5 pages long, then it was 9 pages long, then it was 33 pages long, then it was 49 pages long. And so if we look at how risk communication is handled with pesticides, it's largely done by the label today. And if we look at the soil fumigants, some of the labels regarding PPE are becoming much more detailed to where, maybe that base training is a little different because now it's much more detailed on what your expectations are in managing that particular device or which particular gloves one needs to be wearing.
I would just like to point out one significant communication challenge here is the fact that the word label, when you talk to NIOSH guys about the word label, that means something totally different to a NIOSH person versus the actual label document for a pesticide, which might be a booklet as opposed to a container. Is that right?
Yeah, actually, good point. Basically, when EPA talks about a label in FIFRA, it is the document that is physically affixed to the container as well as the labeling that accompanies it. So it's the label and labeling is all the label. So you are correct. It is not for EPA just that portion of the paper that is glued onto the container. It's that entire 49-page booklet that is still part of the labeling that you could actually pull out of the sleeve. That is all part of the legal document. Okay, good. Go back there. Mouth control. So really, when we look at personal protective equipment, risk mitigation comes down to how well the label communicates that to the individual and how well that individual understands their responsibilities with their protective equipment. And so, again, EPA's responsibility is to provide that information in as clear a fashion as possible to where the applicator who reads that label should be able to understand it, be able to go to the marketplace, pick it up, and be able to use that material. With some training from some people. So back to EPA on the classification. Again, if it's one of these higher risk materials, it's going to have a restricted use and only can be sold to somebody that's a certified applicator. And it's going to say so right on the container. This particular one is a nematicide used on nematodes in the soil, and it's restricted use. It will tell you because of high acute oral, dermal, or inhalation toxicity. And so it may be restricted use because of human protection. It may be restricted for honeybees. It may be restricted for fish, birds, or water. So it's lots of different reasons that something could be restricted. And again, only a certified applicator can purchase that material or use the material, or they may be able to supervise the use of that material. And federal under FIFRA, and does allow the supervision of somebody. And that supervision might mean that you've just got management responsibilities. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily physically standing there watching the application. That's the federal definition. You just have to have management responsibility. And so that's where some concern is, and I know EPA in their regulatory change right now is looking at maybe that definition of what direct supervision might be, to have more management of who that individual is and more required training of that individual. Because WPS, the Worker Protection Standard, manages that fairly well, you know, with some tweaks for agriculture, but in the non-ag arena, there's no requirement for training of that individual that's being supervised. So then again, you've got your general use, lower hazard materials, home and garden materials, etc. So it's really the restricted use. So if we look at this certified applicator group, we basically have either broken out by FIFRA, they separated into two classifications, either private applicator, agricultural commodity is being produced, okay, farms, forests, nurseries, livestock, ranches, etc., or everybody other than private, they classify as commercial applicators. And throughout the states will call that commercial applicator many different types of names. But federally, it's called the commercial applicator. So everything from rights-of-way to aquatics. And if you look at the numbers in these boxes, this was pulled from the Certification Plan and Reporting Database, CFAR, 2010 data that Richard Pont manages for EPA. And there are almost 490,000 private applicators in the United States and over 400,000 commercial applicators in the United States. And then again, if you start thinking about the under the supervision, who those people might be supervising, that number would get very, very large. So, for a private applicator, what FIFRA requires, or the code, what 40 CFR 171, Code of Federal Regulations that governs this, for a private applicator, it requires that that individual show a level of competency. And what's really important to know is that the states all have primacy over applicator certification, and so their standard of what that level of competency is very different. But how the standards read federally is pretty much recognize the pest, understand labels, apply things appropriately according to the label, recognize the environment, and recognize poisoning symptoms and, first aid. So it really doesn't get into much detail. It's fairly broad in expectation. So that's what a private applicator's got to meet. Okay, nothing specific on PPE. Whereas for the commercial applicator, it's a written examination, where for privates it may or may not be written. And the regulation goes into much greater detail on what knowledge and skills that certified applicator has to be competent in, from labeling, label comprehension, human safety, and down in the human safety, actually the need for and the use of PPE is actually stipulated in the regulation, whereas for private applicators it was not. So general safety, safe handling, environment, pests, hazards, dilutions, etc. So all of that is stipulated within 40 CFR. And again, a written examination to actually show some level of competency that that individual can read and interpret labels and has the basic knowledge and skill. So what happened several years ago is the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture got together a writing team, and they put together a core manual, a national manual for those core principles that a certified applicator would have to have. And from the blueprint that basically gives an indication to states what sort of questions they might want to write on the exam, I basically just excerpted what the personal protective focus was from those exam expectations, types of questions somebody might ask about personal protective equipment for a state lead agency that certifies applicators. And so there was one that was on, kind of identifying the minimum equipment, selecting and wearing the right equipment depending on what the label statements were, considering the length of exposure, the situations where you're, making applications above your head, below your head, lots of small droplets, big droplets. Select fit test and wearing respirators was stipulated, should be on the exam. Cleaning, maintaining, and storing personal protective equipment, signs of wear, and disposal. So those are actually stipulated that, and this was shared to all the states, that these are items on PPE that should be considered as part of the core exam for those certified commercial applicators. So that kind of gives you a base for the level of expectation. And this would be the corresponding chapter that came out of the National Core Manual. I just pulled the index right off of that, made a slide out of it, talking about chemical-resistant clothing, coveralls, eyes, respiratory, maintenance of the equipment. So these things are well correlated, the manual and the exam expectation. And you can go on to the NASDA website on your resource document and look at actually what's in the chapters. And all states have some level of core training that's very, very similar to this, because we all borrow and steal from each other. So again, applicator certification is implemented by the states. Several federal agencies, like Department of Defense, Bureau of Reclamation, may have their own federal program, as well as some tribes have a applicator certification program. And those have to be approved by EPA to meet those standards, to make sure that we're meeting that same standard. And but we all do it differently in the state. Questions?
Yeah, Amy actually had a question.
Hey, Amy, you want to come off of *6 and ask your question?
Hi, Carol. It was just actually a reminder to you that you might want to mention again that many states do go beyond the federal requirements, and so they do require training for non-ag pesticide handlers who are applying under the supervision of certified applicators.
Okay, thank you.
So a lot of people in structural and landscape categories who are applying under the supervision actually do have to be trained under their state laws.
Great. Thank you for that reminder. Thank you. So there is an association that if somebody wants to find out who their state lead agency is, it's the Association of American Pesticide Control Officials. You can go in and find out who your contact is for certification and training and who the worker protection standard point is for that state. So it's a good resource. But as Amy Brown just mentioned from University of Maryland, when we go out to the states, all the states do it differently. How we do it in Washington is even slightly different than how they do it in Oregon, which is a little different from Idaho, but very different from California and very different from Pennsylvania, even though everybody meets that minimum standard of somebody that's using a restricted use. But how states then break that out, back to my arrow, is, with the private applicators, some states, all they have to do is attend a training. Others, they just they may have to take a written exam. Like in Washington, they have to take a written exam. Some states, Ohio, I believe, Joanne, if you're on the phone, have to take the core private plus actually a pest management category, whether they're doing soil fumigation, field vegetables, etc.
Hi, this is Jay Parker. It should be pointed out that some of the states you listed it only applies to state workers, like New York, Connecticut. So the state plan only applies to state workers.
For
several states, for several of the states that you listed as having state plans, the plans only apply to state workers,
as opposed to plans like private business.
Keep that in mind. I can get you I have a list in my office of the actual states. Yeah, I think it's New York, New Jersey, and Illinois, maybe, or Connecticut.
If they're a private business and they're using a restricted use pesticide, they would have to be certified by that state.
No, state plan only applies to state workers.
Only OSHA.
Are you talking, excuse me, this is Michelle from EPA.
I'm talking EPA.
I'm talking about,
Okay, I think we may have crossed
I'm sorry, I guess maybe we did, but
right.
it's
So
I still think it's worth pointing out that when it comes to the OSHA state plans, several of the states that you listed, it only applies to state workers.
Correct. Okay, for OSHA, the OSHA regulations for the state primacy on OSHA, there's differences between the states on.
We're just talking about OSHA.
We transitioned into EPA.
You transitioned. I didn't.
Oh, okay.
Okay, sorry.
That's all right.
We do have a question from live
Richard, did you unmute? Richard, when you unmute, come and ask your question, *6.
Carol, that's all I was pointing out is that at the time I was pointing out that he was referring to OSHA state plans and their coverage and not to EPA's, the state certification plans submitted to EPA.
Thank you, Richard. You can hit *6 and clean me up any time, please, because I missed that segue. On the state commercial applicators, as Amy mentioned, basically they're going to have the core exam plus the 10 categories. However, most states, not all, but most states have taken that federal level or that federal standard and added quite a few restrictions on top of that. For example, anybody, whether they're using general use pesticides or those restricted use pesticides, if they do it for hire, they're going to have to be certified applicators. So anybody that might just even be going out and, doing a little bit of Roundup in your yard, even though Roundup, is going to be a general use material, they would have to be certified. So the states are going to bring in, some states say that if you put it through powered equipment, you have to be certified, regardless of the level of hazard. And some just say that any product that you use professionally, you'd have to be certified, unless it was an antimicrobial, such as in a hospital. So really the reach goes much, much further. Plus, in my little map there of the United States, some states may take a product that EPA considered general use, and a state may then restrict it as saying it's state restricted use, and that drives that individual to have to be certified. Because they look at the risk profile when they register it in their state and say, this risk is too great for honeybees in our state, we're going to restrict the use. Or this is a real concern for groundwater in our state, we're going to restrict the use. Or because of some incidents with exposure, we're going to restrict the use. And so it may then drive individuals that otherwise aren't certified in Pennsylvania to have to be certified in the state of Washington. So again, for those becoming certified, basically in 2003 was the data that I could find. So Richard, if you have the proper number for this, please type in. There were only 10 states where private applicators were not certified by a written exam. And I think it's down to 5 or 6 states now. But the data that I could come up with was from 2003. And I know several of those states now do require a written exam. So by and large, most states are requiring a written closed book exam to show competency of those knowledge and skill statements. And some states, for example, New York or Colorado, to get a pesticide license or pesticide certification, also have experience requirements in order to become that certified applicator. So once somebody is certified, in order to retain that credential, they have to go through some level of recertification, whether that be continuing education or retesting. And that's usually done on anywhere from a 2 to 5 year cycle, and some states are similar, some are more rigorous. Some states you may just have to go to one workshop during that cycle, or several workshops, one per year. Some you may have to get 40 credits or 40 training hours. Some are going to say you just flat out have to retest. So it really varies among the states. But there is a requirement for applicator recertification. And the reason I think this is really important to personal protective equipment training is this is the time that most people get a lot more detailed information on the proper selection, use, and decontamination of PPE as compared to that. You have to just know enough to get through that basic knowledge and skills and being able to interpret a label. This is where they really get, hours or 2 hours or 3 hours or 4 hours on training and maybe even get their respirators fit tested and go through some real hands-on experiences is during this recertification process. 4 states that do it as training as compared to just retesting. So again, the curricula will be quite different. Some states don't stipulate what the topics are. You could have everything on golf course turf, weeds if you wanted, and nothing on PPE. Some may say that you've got to have so many training hours in core, and core would include PPE, but they may not say so many in PPE. And some states actually say that you actually have to address PPE in every one of your recertification curricula for that approval period. And I know that this is one thing that EPA is looking at in their regulatory change, is looking at trying to shore up some of those base standards for what recertification training might require as a base. For example, Washington State, we have no stipulation. So an applicator in Washington State wouldn't ever have to have anything on PPE for their entire 50-year career currently. So again, to drive home this direct supervision, if they're working under direct supervision, it's going to depend on how the states have defined that. Some states, it's very broad, management responsibility. Just have to be available if and when needed. With cell phones today, you can be a long way away and still be able to be in contact. With radios, it used to be kind of distant, but now with cell phones, all is off. Now, the worker protection standards for agriculture do have stipulations on what level of training that supervised individual has to undergo prior to having being able to work and be exposed all around pesticides. So direct supervision, again, it varies by the state. Some say it has to be within line of sight and earshot. Some say you have to be physically present, and some states say you can't supervise anybody. Anybody that's going to be applied has to be certified. So they have to have at least shown that level of competency. So labels, basically what drives the label statements is the worker protection standards. The label review manual crafts what those PPE statements are, and then EPA will have other notices to registrants on different things that will have to go on pesticide labels as they're being revised. And again, this happens during re-registration and reevaluation, and when the registrants submit renewals. And I'm going to have to really rock and roll here. So here's a PPE statement. Typically for an ag use product, it'll be in the ag use box and pretty detailed on what is expected of the individual that would be handling that product. This one actually has it broken out for whether the person's mixing and loading or whether they're actually handling in different types of scenarios on what's expected on the PPE, fairly detailed. This might be for non-ag use. It's not going to be in that ag use section, and it might stipulate what type of gloves are actually required. So, and just to give you a light idea, it may just be this little tiny line in a whole bunch of pages, and so somebody's going to have to take the time to sort that needs out in order to best protect themselves. And home and garden products, they're pesticides as well, and some of them will have some personal protective equipment requirements. So the worker protection standard in 3 minutes or less, because we're going to go to break here, is, again, administered by an Environmental Protection Agency, and it's 40 CFR Part 170, and it's only for farms, forests, nurseries, and greenhouses. So it's agriculture, but not ranches. And it's there to protect the people that handle pesticides, whether it's on residue on equipment or actually those that are mixing, loading, and applying, as well as the workers that would be coming back into areas that had been treated. So the definition you want to leave here with today, if this is a new term to you, is that the employer of that person who's a worker, and the worker is somebody that's doing hand labor, irrigation, weeding, harvesting, and if they're in an area within 30 days after treatment, they're legally classified as a worker protection standard worker, and then the employers are responsible for a certain level of education, of training for those individuals. Now, the handlers are those people who are actually mixing, loading, or applying. These are not certified applicators, but they're mixing, loading, applying, or handling contaminated equipment or containers, etc. And so the employers of those employees are responsible for a pretty significant training regime, and those handlers are the people that would be under the supervision of a certified applicator if it was a restricted use pesticide. Even if it was not a restricted use pesticide, if it was a general use pesticide, worker protection standard is in play because all agricultural labels will have the worker protection standard. So let's go ahead.
This is Joe. else, okay, this to me, I'm not very familiar with it. My question, who monitors that certification and education of the users?
Okay. The certification of the applicator for the restricted use pesticides is administered by the state regulatory agency, which is typically the Departments of Agriculture, or it might be the Department of Environmental Conservation. So they handle the certified applicator. In a couple slides, for the worker protection standard, for that employer-employer relationship, it varies. So let's hold off 2 slides and we'll answer that one. So this is also for the worker protection standard is going to deal with commercial applicators and crop advisors. Now there is an exemption for families here that again the worker protection standard, just like OSHA, does not, attest if you're a family member. So it has to be an employee-employer relationship. So it really is very modeled right after OSHA. And the employers basically have to conduct the safety training and provide the PPE as well as other stipulations within that regulation. And so some of the things with PPE, again, they have to provide it, talk about cleaning and maintenance, ensuring that it's worn, talk about heat stress, decontamination, again, the proper use of it, the PPE, and the times when the PPE doesn't have to be worn. And really the only time that it doesn't have to be worn is if there's a closed mixing system or enclosed cockpit. Even though the regulation talks about enclosed cabs like you see with this air blast sprayer, they're not certified and so they're not acceptable. So to answer your question on who is the overseer of the worker protection standard, basically if it's label compliance, many states, the agriculture agency does compliance. In some states, it's going to be solely their OSHA state primacy agency, their labor agency. And in some states, it's going to be a combination of both. So their labor agency will come in and do a use inspection and make sure that the PPE program is adequate and do compliance. And the agricultural agency may come in and say, okay, here's the label. Let's see if you're complying with the label and do it more from a label compliance end. So it's kind of, in some states, it's going to be a dual.
The correlation of any communication.
Do they correlate? If there's an incident, usually they'll work together. If there's not an incident, usually it'll just be 2 different styles of use inspection. More of a labor worker hazard use inspection versus an EPA label compliance use inspection. All right, I think and then Canada has pretty much, they're similar, a little bit different, but they have their own occupational health standards that are not too, and their certified applicator is fairly similar to what we do in the United States. It's just the role between the feds and the provinces are a little different than what we do here in the United States. But their framework for the expectation of what training would have to go on is pretty much identical. And probably really the driving force of what's driving a lot of PPE and work-related training these days is really coming from the marketplace. In order for me to sell my produce to Europe or to Asia, I have to meet these work standards for my employees. And so GLOBAL.Ga.P is really becoming a driving force here. And if you look at some of the safety programs in other countries, South America, Central America, they'll actually exceed what's going on in the United States because they're meeting the GLOBAL.Ga.Ps and these independent audits. So with that, 5 minutes over. Take a break, or should we take a couple questions and then come back for break? Take 2 questions, and we'll come back for break. I've got a question here in the room.
Very in with NIOSH. With different state requirements, any interstate recognition program?
So the question was, with the states being very different, is there any sort of state recognition? And for certified applicators, there is, between some states, formal reciprocity. So that if I become certified in North Dakota, I can take my credential to Minnesota and get a Minnesota license without having to go through the exercise of writing an exam. So,
I imagine that would be important for migrant workers.
well, migrant workers probably aren't going to be handling the pesticides. So usually the handler, so for the worker that's coming in and weeding the fields, they're not dealing with PPE unless they're an early entry worker. But for the person that's typically mixing and loading, they're pretty much permanent employees as compared to a migrant workforce. So, but for the commercial folks, like rights-of-way, where the railroad goes all the way across states, that's where it really becomes more for a commercial pest control business like working or something that's going across state lines is where it's more important for reciprocity. Aerial applicators. One more question, and we'll go to break.
Colleen Miller, also from NIOSH. It seems like, if I understand this right, that you would have a rather broad technical breadth in terms of who you're training for the certification. Has there been any discussions about the obstacles that you've all had to overcome in order to do that successfully?
Yeah, I think the question was, is the broad, diverse audiences that or clientele that we end up dealing with in the certified applicator community and what sort of challenges. And probably the biggest challenges that we have really isn't PPE related as it is on how states have had to deal with their constituents. And so some states will just take a category and break it into 6 different categories to better meet the political need within that state. And instead of having 10 federal categories, has 36 categories. And so and then that doesn't mesh well with this state because they don't have the same categories. And so it's really, there is some real challenges with how states have built their own programs, but many of them had their programs built a foundation before EPA was even formed. So, but for PPE training, it's pretty similar across boards.
There's a difference between different types of things. For instance, in California, they have 3 types of certification. They have the people who make it handle and make it good are dealing with very high concentration, and they need to be trained in system. Then the applicators. The applicators are different in greenhouse than in general field, open environment. So in the greenhouse, maybe it's kind of complicated a little bit. There is no field like the field in the field. So both of them take different types of training. Even in West Virginia, it's a very silent state. We have 3 types of government training.
It's all based on the concentration gradient that they get exposed to. All based on the concentration gradients that they can be exposed to.
And it's not
the people with the high level of concentration are the people who wear the higher level.
But it's not just concentration. We've got to look at risk profile, and so it's not just the concentration of the product, because if the product is very low risk, it doesn't matter how concentrated it is. Yeah. So it really have to look at the risk profile on what's the toxicity of that product and how is that individual being exposed. And that's where PPE really comes into play because it's the barrier for their exposure. If they're doing overhead applications versus somebody that's just spraying along the bottom of a fence with the same product, their risk is very, very different. Right. If they're spraying down at their boots and they put their pant legs in their boots and now they're spraying down in their boots because their pant leg is in the boots instead of out of the boots, that's a much different risk than somebody that wears their pants differently because how they're applying right down at their feet.
So that's really missing from the whole worker protection standard thing, because there's no concentration basis for selecting a respirator like we do and like OSHA requires. So, you're not...
I think the January meeting can address that. I can't address what goes on labels, but I think your January meeting will address that. My role is taking what's on the label and trying to help an applicator make sure that they have.
But we're talking here about different concentrations, but that's not being used in the selection of PPE for pesticide protection against pesticides. Concentration is not a factor. It's not addressed on the label.
It's
not a factor.
If you go to the label review manual, the concentration of that risk profile should be translated into what PPE is put on that label.
Yeah, like for a fumigant, they say to use a supply air respirator, but beyond that, I've looked at these labels and there's no difference. You know, it says use an organic vapor cartridge with an N, P, or R filter. But if you're at a certain concentration level, that type of respirator may not